During the Mexican Revolution, there are four major leaders, actually four leaders total. First is Porfirio Diaz. He was an iron-fist dictator after the revolution in Mexico. He reigned for half a century, and the U.S. loved him because he was economically favorable to the U.S. In 1908, he announced that he wouldn't run for re-election, but in 1910, he ran anyway, and the Mexicans were very irritated by this and began protesting because they hated Diaz and Diaz lied to them, and because he gave the U.S. preferential treatment. He couldn't put down the protesters, and so in 1911, he was forced to leave by those protesters, especially Francisco Madero, who overthrew Diaz and took over. Then the Treaty of Ciudad Juarez was passed, which finalized the ousting of Diaz and the administration of Madero. Madero was pro-democracy and pro-land reform, but in 1913 he was killed. The people loved him, but the people who benefited under Diaz did not. And Victoriano Huerta, who was among those people who did not love him, killed him. And Huerta took over. Or he had Madero killed, same thing. Wilson didn't like Huerta because he found the dictatorship deplorable. That isn't too good for a country when your neighbor and a world power of the hemisphere hated him. He didn't have domestic control because he was disliked for being a dictator and for killing Madero because the people loved Madero. And he had three major people who kind of wanted his job, including Carranza, Zapata, and Villa. Carranza had support in the north, Zapata had support in the south, and Villa had support randomly. The U.S. supported Carranza. In 1914, in Tampico, Mexico, some U.S. sailors were arrested. 2 weeks later, Wilson ordered an attack on Veracruz. 200 people were killed and 300 were injured, and most of those people were civilians. And that made civilians angry because Huerta couldn't protect them from the U.S. I mean, you've got this guy in office, you don't like him already, and now under his protection, he is letting the neighboring country kill your people. That's just not cool. So, by 1915, a year later, Huerta's government collapsed, and Carranza took office. One of those people who wanted his job. Hey, he won! He was pro-U.S., and like I said, the U.S. liked him. Mexico resented Carranza because they thought he'd be the U.S. puppet because the U.S. liked him. And that's how that worked. In 1916, in Columbus, New Mexico, Villa, one of the other ones who wanted the job, and some rebels invaded the U.S. on horseback. They set fire to the city and basically put the Southwest in absolute panic. He was a hero in Mexico, and General John Pershing went to Mexico with 500 soldiers to capture him, but he never did. The revolution could be considered a civil war because it was internal. There was no foreign country to overthrow. There were several causes. Socially, there was the ideology that they deserved better and more, and this was reinforced in 1913 by Wilson believing that Huerta was deplorable. Economically, the U.S. controlled 50% of the oil and 40% of the land in Mexico. That would not be tolerated in the U.S. if the tables were turned. So imagine how Mexico felt. Secondly, there was maldistribution of wealth. The bigger that gap between rich and poor is, the more likely you're going to have a revolution, because you've got such a huge number of poor people, and they want better circumstances. Third, there was a decrease in domestic food production, which led to dependence on other countries, and dependence raises prices. And lastly, the U.S. had Mexicans working for little money, kind of like we have in China today. They felt like they deserved more, and in the end there were quite a few strikes, especially in the textile and mining industries. Lastly, there are political causes. Diaz announced that he wouldn't run, which got people's hopes up that he would be gone because they hated him, but then he ran anyway, and so they were angry. Secondly, there were political rivalries. For instance, Madero Madero had Huerta on his back, and eventually Huerta killed him, and Huerta had Carranza, Zapata, and Villa. Rivalries lead to instability. It makes sense. Just think about it. It makes the leadership focus on things other than the country. Third, there was failed diplomacy. Huerta couldn't win over Wilson, and the U.S. invaded Tampico, which showed the Mexicans that Huerta couldn't protect Mexico from the U.S., and that made them angry, and scared. Your leader can't protect you. That means your country is not safe. It's just not a good situation to be in. There were also effects of the revolution. Socially, there was Zapata's plan of Ayala, which never actually happened, but it inspired the Article of 27. The plan basically said that they should turn over large tracts of land to the government to be redistributed to the masses. It was just his plan. Economically, first, in 1954, Lázaro Cárdenas was elected, which is a pretty big step considering the last four leaders were just overthrowing the previous leader. And the first one was reigning for 50 years, approximately. Second, millions of acres from the private sector were given to peasants. And lastly, Pemex was established, which is Petroleum Mexico. It's Mexican-owned and controlled oil company. And that's a huge step considering earlier 50% of the oil in Mexico was controlled by the U.S. and now they had their own oil company. Politically, it made the government unstable. It had instability for Diaz, Madero, Huerta, and Carranza, because you've got all these revolutions going on. How could it not be unstable? And in 1929, PRI, which stands for the Institutional Revolutionary Party, maintained control, or dominance, for 70 years. It began in 1929. So that was an effect. You had a new party. Alfred Zimmermann was a German foreign minister, and he sent a telegram to Mexico requesting that there was a German-Mexican attack on the U.S. And if they did that, they would give Mexico back what we took in the Mexican-American War. It was published in the U.S. papers, and although it never happened, it gave the U.S. a slight scare. And lastly, there was two things that happened that are social, economic, and political. First, in 1917, the Mexican Constitution was passed. There are a lot of articles, over 100, but there are two main ones that are very important. The first is Article 27, which basically stated that all pre-revolutionary contracts of Mexico with foreign companies are abolished, and it mainly focused on oil and minerals. And secondly, it said that the Mexican government was the owner of all water, mineral, and property rights in Mexico's soil and subsoil. That means that not just on the surface, they don't just own the trees and the top 3 inches of soil, they own Mexico to the core of the earth, so that other countries can't come in and say, well, you own the trees and the rocks, but I think I own anything that's 50 feet below the surface. So that was pretty big for them. The second important article was Article 123, which guaranteed the right for organization of labor. That means labor unions, which protected against that really cheap labor that the U.S. was coming in and taking from the Mexicans. Taking is the wrong word. The second thing that is all three is that they had a stronger sense of security. Now they had control of their government. It wasn't just dictators. In 1919, Zapata was killed. In 1920, Carranza was killed. In 1923, Villa was killed.